Ned Hall is Professor of Philosophy at Harvard University, specialising in metaphysics and philosophy of science, as well as the foundational problems associated with quantum physics. He is one of the world's leading experts on causation and is the author of Causation, a User's Guide. In this interview and discussion, he addresses the relationship between the philosophical issue of causation and its relationship with realism and anti-realism. Realism and causation, because obviously I know causation is a big area for you. Is it even possible to be an expert or believe in causation and be an anti-realist? Is that even possible?
Oh, that's a good question. I think there are enough varieties of anti-realism that some positions that their advocates or more likely their opponents would characterize as anti-realist are compatible with believing in causation. So it might be good to just spend a minute charting different kinds of anti-realism. There's von Frosten style anti-realism about really small stuff.
Observable entities, that kind of, yeah.
That's right. And my sense is that in philosophy of science and in science itself, that kind of anti-realism isn't taken so seriously anymore, partly because when you get to the point where you can directly manipulate things on the small scale, it's kind of hard to be resolutely agnostic about whether they really exist. But there are other kinds of anti-realism. So if you talk to some physicists and ask them what their aspirations are or their aspirations are for their discipline, you might be told that one of the things that they hope to uncover are the fundamental laws governing our universe. And that notion of law is incredibly important in the history and in the current practice of physics. But it's philosophically a somewhat vexed notion. Depending on how much philosophy of science background you have, the examples that are standardly used might be familiar, but they might not. We can point to very general truths about our cosmos, and with the right choice of examples, you can kind of vividly see a contrast between truths that strike us as somehow fundamental or grounded in the laws of nature and truths that are more accidental. And the standard example that has been used for years is, let's suppose it's a truth that nowhere in the cosmos, past, present, or future, is there a quantity of gold, pure gold, more than a mile in diameter, say. That might be true. Let's suppose it is, for the sake of discussion. We also have extremely good reason to believe it's true that nowhere in the cosmos is there a quantity of uranium-235 a mile in diameter. What's our reason? Because before any such quantity could be formed, the nuclear reactions would melt it down or cause it to explode. So you look at the second of those and you think that's not merely true, but it's non-accidentally true. Whereas the first one, assuming it is true, seems to be true as a matter of pure brute contingency. And that's a way to sort of zero in on this distinction that we intuitively draw between kind of fundamental necessary features of our world and features that are more contingent. Now, you could be an anti-realist about that. You could think there is no such distinction out in the world. All there is something like a distinction between true statements about our cosmos that are particularly important to us for doing prediction or explanation because of the way we are, and other truths that strike us as less important. And this is a kind of anti-realism that would go back to Hume and Hume's skeptical position about causation. And if you have that kind of anti-realism, then what you think about causation is going to get affected. I mean, the simple thing to say is you won't believe in causation. As it happens, there are plenty of philosophers who subscribe to this kind of anti-realist position about laws and necessity and still believe in causes. It's just that, to put it very crudely, they think that causal relations are nothing more than certain kinds of distinctive patterns or relations subsumed under distinctive patterns. There's a background issue just about terminology. Sometimes you'll find in philosophy, especially nowadays, that there's a really blurry line between a philosophical position that's anti-realist about X and a philosophical position that says, no, I believe in X. I just think X is a lot less metaphysically interesting or robust than my opponents think. And that can happen in discussions of causation. You could put it this way. There are philosophers who believe in what you might think of as metaphysically robust necessities in the world. They really think, for example, that laws of nature are something over and above the patterns in the phenomena, something that governs or directs those patterns. And those people will believe in a robust kind of causation. Lots of work to be done in unpacking what causation is against that metaphysical background. But those people will believe, there's, in some robust sense, there are sort of real powers in the world. Then there are people who will just be resolutely anti-realist and say, no, there are no such things. They're just patterns, and we should dispense with all talk of laws and causes entirely. And then there are people whose position is very difficult to discern from the second group, who will say, no, 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 I believe in laws. And I even believe in causes. My view of them is just very metaphysically deflationary. My opponents, for example, will say that laws of nature are something like principles that genuinely govern how things must go. I will say, no, laws of nature are merely distinctive patterns, de facto patterns in the phenomena. That last position is a very popular one in philosophy of science right now. Its proponents typically don't call themselves anti-realists, but for an outsider, you could be forgiven for thinking that this is like a very, very fine terminological distinction, between that view and the view that just says, say, there are no laws or causes at all. So I guess, capsule summary, anti-realism about sort of real physical necessity is, to my mind, immediately going to generate a corresponding anti-realism about causes and effects, just because roughly that's one species of necessity.
So the group that, for example, you're distinguishing, there could be someone that believes in meta-universal law, so to speak, causally, and then there are those that can agree to that but believe that what we actually see in the world is more in terms of patterns, so that's dealing with a looser definition of causation.
Yeah.
But if that is the case, even though we just see these patterns that we can make a sense of in terms of correlation, explanation and prediction, couldn't they still say that that is a form of causation instead of loose patterns? Isn't that just a semantic play on words? Because surely if there are patterns just occurring that we're observing, why can't we say that they still are causation, or they're just saying it's a looser causation than the meta universal law?
I think what you just said is a good way of putting it. People who go in for this sort of their just patterns view can definitely say that there's causation, and will go on to say, look, what we call causal relations is some kind of loosely defined structure within the patterns. And you can certainly distinguish the kinds of structure you're interested in from mere correlation. You don't have to give up on the idea that there's an important difference between mere correlation and causation. But at bottom, you'll say what it comes to say that, say, one event causes another, is to say that those two events fit in a certain way in an overall pattern of events. It's not that there's any genuine exercise of power by cause that helps bring about the effect, or any kind of necessity to the connection underwritten, say, by kind of metaphysically heavyweight fundamental laws.
In terms of a pragmatic view of the world, obviously in science, medicine in particular, we deal with the entity and concept of causation all the time, and everyone can appreciate that. How do you feel the best way to approach causation in the world today? Because clearly we have concepts that are very useful that we can't dispose of. So how do you think we should generally talk about causation?
Oh, that's a great question. It's a big question, but I can give you a kind of summary of the view that strikes me as most promising. I actually think that there are two distinct ways that we naturally find ourselves thinking in causal terms, and that it can be very helpful to distinguish them. On the one hand, there's a way of using causal notions that's very closely tied to our interest in manipulation and control of our environment. And you can see this just in simple decision making, like, should I have another cup of coffee? Well, it would taste good, but it would make me jittery. And in just doing that deliberation, I'm thinking in causal terms. I'm thinking about how would the future, or the little local bit of the future I'm concerned about, depend on my particular choice here. And it's very natural to unpack that in counterfactual terms, to say, if I were to do X, Y would happen. If I were to do Z, W would happen. And my interest in the causal structure of the world, at least in this sphere of my life, is an interest in the kinds of patterns of dependency that are at least potentially usable for purposes of manipulation and control. And Jim Woodward's book, Making Things Happen, is probably the locus classicus nowadays of the development of this way of thinking about causation. But there is another way we think, which is more retrospective, where we fix on something in the world that's happened, and we want a kind of narrative story of what were the processes that led up to that happening. And that's a very different way of thinking about causation in terms of something like ongoing causal processes, the contours of which still need to be worked out. You can see the difference in some kinds of examples. So like the standard example I like to use is this one. Imagine that we have two young vandals, Billy and Susie, and they're out breaking windows for sport. And they both pick up rocks and throw them at a nearby window, and they're both incredibly accurate. But Susie is just a little bit faster. So it's her rock that hits the window and breaks it. Billy's would have if she hadn't thrown. His was a split second behind. So if we look at the windows breaking, we all immediately agree, given that we know the background story, about what caused the window to break. We agree on the explanatory question, why did the window break? Well, because Susie's rock struck it. And we can also add, well, Billy's rock would have broken it, but that's neither here nor there when it comes to what in fact explains the breaking. What in fact explains the breaking is Susie's action. But notice that if you were sort of looking at this prospectively, if you had an interest, say, in either in preventing the window from breaking, it wouldn't be enough to know that Susie is connected to it. To prevent it from being broken in the first place, you would have had to block both of them. And from the standpoint of, as it were, controlling the fate of the window, Susie and Billy are on a par. They're both equally deadly threats to the window. So the kind of perspective on causation that emphasizes the importance of manipulation and control of our surrounding doesn't really care about the difference between them, between Billy and Susie in a case like this. But the kind of perspective that emphasizes wanting to understand why things turned out the way they did really does draw a sharp distinction here. And to my mind, this is one of the more important distinctions for philosophers to get clear on. When you're thinking pragmatically, how can we actually use the concept of causation? First preliminary step, to my mind, is to distinguish the purposes for which we want a concept of causation. And one kind of purpose is bound up with our interest in manipulating and controlling our surroundings. And another kind of purpose is bound up with our sort of more, you could call it, I guess, if you like, a more intellectual and less practical interest in just understanding why things go the way they go.
Now, causation is a very old and often controversial issue in philosophy and contemporarily in philosophy of science, especially when applied to arguments concerning realism and anti-realism, an area that gets a lot of attention in contemporary philosophical and scientific debates with regards to causation is neuroscience and its explanatory power in terms of correlations. Some think that we simply just have correlations. Others like to stretch the argument a bit further and say that neurological activities literally are mental states and therefore cause these mental states. As an expert in causation, how would you start to think about the issue of causation in neuroscience and consciousness?
Sure. There'll be a little bit inchoate. I have lots of views about causation, but fewer views about neuroscience and its connections to consciousness, partly because I think that the problems are just so incredibly difficult. It's hard to even get clear on what the problems are. Like you can start with sort of this general sense that there's something distinctively puzzling about sentience. There have been various attempts to try to get clear on what the puzzle is, but I'm not even sure that they've succeeded yet. Certainly, I don't think anyone would think that it's enough to track correlations between neurophysiological states and conscious states. That is, we may do a fantastic job of mapping those correlations, and that will be incredibly useful information to have. But for those people who are puzzled by consciousness and don't understand how it fits into a broadly naturalistic worldview, knowing those correlations isn't going to be enough. Typically what you want for a kind of reductive explanation in the sciences is some kind of explanatory backing for the correlations. So, to take a really, really simple example that connects to some things on causation, suppose we are early chemists and we have some fairly phenomenological categories that we use to do chemistry, like acid and base, for example. And then things get sophisticated and people start noticing correlations between the acidity of a substance and certain aspects of its chemical structure. We fast forward 100 years when we actually know the atomic theory and know quite a lot about how chemical compounds are put together. In that case, it's very natural to think that we can simply identify the relevant properties of being acidic or being basic with certain chemical properties. We've actually learned what those properties are. And part of what makes it easy to do that identification is that we can look at what we can sort of step back and reflect on what our concepts of acidity and basicness are, and realize that in a certain sense, those are functional concepts. And, with enough care, you could actually come up with a fairly sharp functional characterization of these properties. And that's where causation would come in. You would say something like the property of being acidic or being acidic to a certain degree is just the property of being such that you will react to certain other things in certain characteristic ways. And then obviously you need to fill in the details. And then once you've got that functional characterization, you can say, okay, at the molecular level, we found out what plays that functional role. and everything goes very smoothly. And to my mind, as a relative outsider on debates in philosophy of mind, so feel obliged to put in that qualification, one of the stubborn problems about consciousness is that it doesn't seem like a functional characterization of consciousness is capturing the entirety of what we mean. And why not? Well, there's this sort of sense that it leaves out the distinctive what it's likeness of consciousness, that can't just be captured in purely causal or functional terms. And I'm not sure if that's right. This goes back to my sort of opening kind of wail of frustration about how difficult it is to pin down what precisely the hard problem is. But if it is right, then it means that certain strategies for kind of reductively identifying higher level properties in terms of lower level properties that work quite well in other areas of science are going to founder here. And in particular, we may, as it were, become convinced by all the evidence of correlation between neurophysiological states and conscious states, assuming we amass it satisfactorily. We may be convinced that somehow conscious states really are neurophysiological states, but I think the sense of dissatisfaction is going to persist as long as we can't employ the same kind of strategy that we do in the case of, heat and molecular motion or acidity and certain chemical properties and so on.
So just to summarize some of those points there. Firstly, it's a problematic issue because we don't have a unified, accepted definition of what consciousness is.
Yeah.
And therefore, when we also test this out empirically, we can just map out correlations between certain activities, but we don't know if that necessarily maps on directly to consciousness because we have a problem defining consciousness.
Yeah, that's right. And again, if you have the property of being an acid, we do have there's going to be some vagueness involved in defining the property, but we can give a reasonable enough functional definition that the correlation between the acidity of a substance and certain aspects of its chemical structure will now seem not at all accidental. It'll seem to be a correlation underwritten by the fact that the chemical property really just is, or if you like, is the realizer of the chemical property. And right, we seem to lack that in the case of consciousness.